All right. So, Sullivan Falls. I can turn off my camera for this, I think, or maybe not. Sullivan Falls, you might know it better as Tidal Falls today. It's right between Hancock and Sullivan, and you might think of it as a picnic place or a park to watch the birds or the kayakers dipping in and out of the water, or where the Lobster Pound and restaurant was for most of the 20th century. From an ecological perspective, you might think of the falls in their role as separating Taunton Bay from the ocean, creating a large estuary. And these falls have a rich and complex history on many levels. And tonight I'll be touching on that just a bit. Primarily the relationship between the humans and the falls themselves. So last semester at the University of Maine, both of my research projects were on Sullivan Falls. One of them was on the environmental history, and the other was to explore the process of digitally recreating the falls to their pre-1871 levels, which is when the blasting began. And there's still so much to learn, so I'm just going to touch on that all tonight. And we'll start with the geology. So going back between 400 and 500 million years ago, when plates and crusts were really starting to move, Laurentia was a large continent that would eventually become the core of North America, and Avalonia was a microcontinent. It began as a volcanic arc off the coast of Gondwana. It collided with Laurentia, where eventually it would make up most of the Atlantic provinces and a sliver of the New England coast. Later, when Pangaea broke apart, East Avalonia went on to make up most of England and parts of Northwest Europe. So if you want to feel connected in some way to the old world other than being in New England, you can just go hunting for some bedrock east of the falls. And MDI is not part of Avalonia, though. That's much younger, from the coastal volcanic belt. And Taunton Bay marks I'm showing here, here's Avalonia today, so you can see it's a rough summary there of where the two parts of that continent ended up. But so Taunton Bay marks a pretty clear collision point of the two continents. On the west side, the Hancock side, there's the much older Ellsworth schist. And on the east, it's granite and gabbro. And the depression that became the bay, that was where the friction was so hot, about 500 degrees Celsius, that it caused the rocks at depth to melt and crumble. And originally, that would have been much deeper. And of course, it was filled in over the millions of years, and of course, the glaciers that came later. And much more recently, the continental glaciers, like the one now covering Antarctica, extended across Maine several times during the Pleistocene epoch, between about 1.5 million years ago and 10,000 years ago. And that slow-moving ice changed the surface of the landscape, scraping over mountains, disrupting earlier stream patterns, creating hundreds of ponds and lakes. And one of these was Taunton Bay, which was actually a giant lake. It was made by the glacier's retreat about 13,000 years ago, when it was retreating from this area. There was Falls Point was the margin point of the glacier. You can see that here in this map. It's bright green. It's a unique spot. It was probably a lake before the glaciers at some point because of the age of the bedrock underneath the falls that was there for a great long while, geologically speaking. But the most recent ice age that weighed down the land hundreds of feet. This was the Laurentide Glacier. And as it moved over Maine, it scraped the bedrock, leaving the striations that showed the direction that the ice moved in. And so from the little arrows just opposite of Falls Point, you can see that the glacier moved northwest from here. And as it did, the ocean followed. It took a long while for the land to bounce back from the glaciers. And Falls Point itself is a northeast trending ridge consisting of a mix. It's a glacial till, coarse sand and gravel laying on top of the bedrock, and that marks the former position of the glacier margin. So Falls Point was, in effect, it was a dam. Originally, it went all the way across. And here's a current watershed map of Taunton Bay, so you can get an idea of the water that filled it back when it was a lake. That through that lake there was a small river, which you can still see the footprint of down through the middle of the bay, low tide or looking from satellite. That river was the downflow of water. It pushed a lot of the glacial rocks and boulders down to the bottom of the lake, where Falls Point had formed the dam, and it eroded those rocks over time and eventually began eroding at Falls Point itself. And then the ocean levels began rising. Eventually the ocean levels rose up enough that it started eroding from the other side. And at some point the dam was breached, creating Taunton Bay. And humans were here around the time that happened, which is fascinating. The ancestors of the Wabanaki, Passamaquoddy, ocean levels rose pretty quickly between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago. They came up from like 58 feet to about 16 feet below today's levels. And it could have been noticeable within a lifetime or two. And by 2,000 years ago, the tides were similar to today's. So that erosion would have further opened up the gap to something similar to what we see today. And we know that the falls were a sacred place to the ancient Wabanaki because they built a big cemetery right there. And the reason we know about the cemetery is because in 1883, when the workers were digging to lay tracks for the railroad on the Hancock side, they tore into the graves. And they found many fine artifacts, but the tragedy was that these graves were in the way of progress. They were just torn apart. Nothing was documented. Workers took the finest pieces. You could see this Ellsworth American article that was noteworthy because they found so many fine tools. And later in 1913, Warren Moorhead, who was looking for his red paint cemeteries, he came to Sullivan Falls to see if they could make anything out of what was left. He knew it had been largely destroyed back in 1883, but he also knew it was probably a red paint cemetery. And he had with him a man who was there when the railroad workers were digging back in 1883, and this man, Mr. Stratton, recalled the blacksmith shop nearby having large metal tubs overflowing with artifacts. And those are the ones that were intact because the broken ones were just tossed over the side of the bank. And he also recalled a massive gouge/adze combination tool of polished green slate measuring almost 2 feet long. And that was just a memory because someone took that back when, but Moorhead did find one other similar example at the Emerson Cemetery in Alamoosuk, which was about half that size, and you can see that here. So imagine something about 2 feet long like that would be quite an impressive tool. And Moorhead also found that the burials at Sullivan Falls were in two parallel rows, about 15 feet apart. One very unique feature of the site, which may not have been connected to the burial tradition, was several large ash pits, with one being nearly 7 feet across. He hadn't seen such large ash pits before, nor so deep. There were no bones or artifacts in the pits, so their purpose couldn't be determined. And only one grave was found near an ash pit, and it was 48 centimeters deep. It had artifacts, no ochre, so it wasn't a red paint grave, it was older. And the black ash layer of the fire pit nearby was even deeper than this early grave. So the fires had been in use before the Moorhead burial tradition, and they had been in use, repeated use, over thousands of years. They were used and reused over long periods of time. Perhaps there was a practical purpose, but it's more likely that it was a ceremonial practice. The Wabanaki have long shared creation stories pertaining to waterways. Place names referred to characteristics of waterways, and sites with rapids or falls are always significant in their oral histories. For example, in the late 17th century, Nicholas Dennis, who was observing the Wolastoqiyik over on the St. John River in New Brunswick, he documented their belief that the reversing falls at the mouth of the river there possessed their own spirit, or Manitou, and they made regular offerings to the falls, which the French did not approve of course. They forced them out of that practice. But the artifacts found at Sullivan Falls and Falls Point, they span thousands of years. And here is a map drawn by an assistant of Moorhead's from that 1913 trip. See the guide, the little letters there. The letter A, that denotes the freshwater spring, which would have been important. B and C are shell heaps, and D is the red paint cemetery, and little letters there. So that history is from several thousands of years ago, and we jump ahead to recorded history. The first or earliest description of the falls that we have, it comes from the journal of Captain George Manning, who was up here in August of 1677 as part of the Northeast Coast campaign of the First Abenaki War. He had come up around MDI. He was looking for French and Wabanaki. He entered the bay. He saw some sails and some canoes, which he pursued, and they led him through the falls, which he called a cruel and most formidable place. He clipped a ledge, nearly capsized, but recovered, and then he found himself trapped on the other side, where he had to engage in near constant exchange of fire until the tide rose and the wind could carry him back out the next morning. He was so jarred by that experience that on his way out, he went right past some other French ships and canoes he saw. He hightailed it out of Dodge back to the open waters. He didn't want to get trapped in that place again. And in that journal, he refers to the place name as Duwukit. And just a few years earlier, in 1674, he was here for trade, and he referred to it as Adawakit. So it's time to talk about the name. And I've done a lot of speaking with native speakers of the language. So it originates, it's a Passamaquoddy name, Adawakit, which means a place with the hole dug out by the tide. And the English wrote that down as Adawakit in various spellings. The French did Duwakit, various spellings. And then the late New England colonial, they began using Wakig from the late 18th century. It was a corruption of that. So Excuse me. So the meaning, it doesn't mean seal, it doesn't mean horseback. The original name, it refers to not only the process of how the falls came to be, with the water digging out this opening, but also to the deep pit where the repeated action of the tides on either side of the falls created these deep holes, creating something that the New Englanders would later refer to as the cellar hole. So knowing that this name referred to the falls, we can learn a lot more about Antoine de la Motte Cadillac's seigneury of 1688, which granted him Mont Desert et Duaquet. So this brilliant map was made by V. Kelly Bellis, right in Ellsworth, using his skills as a surveyor to map out the bounds of this French land grant. You can see MDI, Mont Desert, is obvious, and you can see that Duaquet is centered around Taunton Bay and the falls and Frenchman's Bay. Go in here a little closer. So what we now know as Frenchman's Bay was actually the Rivière Duaquet, and this was the Frenchman Cadillac's land grant, which has its own story to tell that someone will tell hopefully someday. So names change over time. It's fascinating to trace them back. Then we jump ahead to New England settlers. They first came here in the 1760s. They named this New Bristol at first, and late 18th and 19th century histories of Hancock County, they record French ruins found at Crabtree Neck and what is now Sorrento. Some settlers built their homes on top of these ruins because why waste a good cellar? Some of them, they used the materials, rocks, to build their own cellars. This is a 1795 map of Sullivan drawn by A. Green Crabtree, because Hancock didn't exist until 1828. But you could see folks settled along the water. The town's first meeting house was at the Saltwater Falls, which you could see there. They have their little road is passing right through the falls. The town's meeting house was there from the 1760s through at least 1820. That was the central location where folks could come together easily, though it might have been interesting to see how they passed over the falls at that time. They used a ferry, which evolved quite a bit over the years. And so lumber was the first industry to sustain the area. It was known for its pumpkin pine. It's an orange tinted pine. And lumber would be floated down Taunton Bay and over the falls, sometimes on great rafts to reach Sullivan Harbor, which must have been fascinating to watch. And actually, Ambrose Simpson, he wrote a bit about watching that as a boy when he, back in the early 1820s. And granite was the next big industry. The quarries were all north of the falls, mostly along Taunton Bay. That meant an issue of transport. By 1835, there were 6 quarries, and by 1880, there were over 20. And in 1871, there were 100 cargoes of lumber and granite that passed through the falls. And by 1890, at the peak of things with the Phillips Eaton tugboat, 331 cargoes went through, pulling about 120,000 tons, and more cargoes went through without the aid of the tugboat. But only smaller 2-masted ships could pass through the falls, and it could only be done at high tide, slack tide, a very small window of time. If winds weren't right or you missed that window, you had to wait. And ships often had to wait days, sometimes weeks, to make it back out through the falls. And meanwhile, demand for granite exploded. So there were a lot of ships waiting around because they could only take smaller loads. Any ship with a draft of more than 6 feet couldn't pass through, or it would be dashed on the underwater ledges. And so with that increased traffic, there were more shipwrecks. Many each year, sometimes multiple in one day, like May 1st, 1868. They had two back to back. Sometimes the ships would be stuck on the ledges for weeks. Other times they'd float off at the next tide. You never knew what was going to happen. You really had no control over what your ship did going through the falls. So here's just a smattering of some of the shipwrecks taken from local newspapers. As you can see, Sullivan Falls was a hotbed for disasters. And then this map kind of shows why. This is a map from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in 1975. You can see the dry ledge down in the lower right. That was the great huge ledge. It had an extension of several underwater ledges out surrounding that. Hatcher's Rock. In the center, there were other ledges on the side of that. And so there were only two channels through which you could pass through the falls, either around the dry ledge, or you could make it through by Hatcher's Rock. You know, you had to go around dry ledge one way or the other, and you had no control over which channel you went. The tide decided that for you. So you can see why there were so many disasters there. And it was a very tight fit, because from shore to shore at high tide, it's just 577 feet. And that many obstacles in that space with those rapid waters, that's a very dangerous spot. The pilot boats didn't help much. So in 1870, surveyors were sent from the federal government to see what improvements to navigation needed to be made. And between 1871 and 1913, over $226,000 were appropriated for blasting to improve the navigation. But because of the difficulty of the work, divers had only minutes each tide to go down. No one really wanted to do it. So only 50,000 was actually used, or, taken up by bidders. In the 1870s, the blasting was done with nitroglycerin, transported in big jugs on specially made wagons packed with hay. A wagon was dispatched from Boston every 2 days. And because of the highly dangerous nature of the cargo, the two men with each wagon, they could only travel at night when there was minimal traffic on the road. And during the day, they had to find a remote spot away from other people and out of town to sleep. And they would barricade themselves with warning signs so that no one would approach. It took about 2 weeks for each wagon to arrive, and it was quite the scene when they did. It's exciting to see some, the explosives coming into town. But the nitro didn't work so well in the falls. It did work for removing the old bridge pilings further up the bay. And when the early blastings didn't improve things much, the towboat appeared on the scene with its coal-powered engine, and the Sullivan Falls Towboat Company came about, with the Phillips Eaton being the star of that show. And later efforts used TNT, dynamite, so they could use a lot more if they had a skilled diver. And they were skilled. And we don't know who did the first blastings in 1871, but in 1874, it was Mr. E.M. Leprone. 1897, it was W.D. Johnson. In 1899 and 1903, it was H.H. Sturgis. And in 1913, it was W. Scott Tibbets. And I'll read this snippet from the July 8th, 1903 piece from the Ellsworth American that describes the work done. It says, Uncle Sam is always helping commercial traffic. Sullivan Falls is a thoroughfare that has been used for upward of 2 centuries according to authentic history. Sullivan Falls is at the very head of Frenchman's Bay, 6 miles from Bar Harbor. When the Maine Central Railroad came into this territory 20 years ago, the plan was to have the terminus here, but owing to ice in the winter, the railroad concluded to abandon this location and from near Waukegan Station extended the survey to what is now Mount Desert Ferry, 2 miles further down the bay. The lumber industry at Franklin during the first half of the 19th century made shipping quite extensive through these falls, but all of that business was done in little 2-masted schooners, and obstructions to navigation were little noticed except by those actually engaged in the service. Of late years, the granite industry, at Franklin and at West Sullivan, has been steadily growing, and a fleet of large 3-masters is now engaged in carrying cargoes to the large cities. The falls are about 50 yards wide and 100 yards through. There are 2 channels on the outer side, made by a large ledge of the hardest rock. The falls are a tideway for the upper bay, which is about 100 yards wide for a mile up. Then it forms into a circular bay about a mile across, and then the river again extends, narrowing for 4 miles right up through the town of Franklin to the very foot of Old Scudic Mountain. These falls present a peculiar and awe-inspiring spectacle. At low tide, there used to naturally be about 6 feet of water, and a trifle over 12 feet at high tide. The tide in the outer bay, Frenchman's, comes in for 2 hours and rises 3 feet. Then the tide in the falls turns and runs upriver at a tremendous rate. Only at high water and at dead low water can work be done here. Then there is but 6 minutes quiet, when again the surging begins. For some years, a towboat service has been maintained by the granite operators to replace the old hazardous method of sailing in and out under a pilot. This old way was too hazardous and caused too much demurrage. Owing to the use of larger craft in the shipping business, it became imperative on the part of the government to improve and deepen the channel. Several good-sized appropriations have been used here. The one now being expended is the 5th and is a $5,000 one. The work is in charge of a former contractor, Mr. Sturgis, a Maine man. The work is performed by 4 or 5 men. Mr. Sturgis is a diver, and with his attendant and the use of a scow and 2 assistants, he has 6 minutes at high water and the same at low water to do his work. At slack tide, he and his men prepare the survey ranges and the dynamite charges. He does not blast at every tide, as he only has time to make a hasty survey of what has been done. When he makes a blast, he and his men get the scow over to the right spot. Then he goes down and places the charge of dynamite, gets his gear ashore, and explodes the charge by electricity. The charge is simply laid on the ledge that is to be removed. The immense water pressure offsets the recoil, and when a charge goes off at low water, a volume of water is forced into the air for 50 or 60 yards in a solid column. Then, like a skyrocket, it breaks and comes down in a beautiful shower of spray. When the blast is in the morning or late afternoon with the sun as a background, that spray makes a most beautiful rainbow effect. Much heavier charges are fired at high water than at low water, so that explosion effect is about the same. Mr. Sturgis has become so skilled at the work that at times he makes 2 or 3 explosions each tide. Excuse me. All right, but in 1913, that was the, oops, hold on, to get a drink of water. All right, so next slide, here is an image from our archives. and I've colorized. It's from the blasting of 1897, of which was written, "Residents of Sullivan have been enjoying of late the sight of water from Sullivan Falls being thrown more than 100 feet into the air. It is caused by blasting rock from the falls in order that vessels may safely pass through. C.W. Johnston of Laurel, Delaware is in charge of the work, which is said to be extremely interesting. The men can only work at ebb tide, at which time they put in a charge of dynamite among the rocks underwater, then go out in a boat for some distance, where it is fired with a battery." And next, you can see a much larger blast. This is from 1913. And it's written that the explosions themselves make a mighty pleasing sight. People come from miles around daily to witness them, to see great pillars of water and rock arise from the falls where a ship channel is being slowly created. All of these explosions are made at high tide, as the volume of water at its greatest depths is absolutely necessary when using such quantities of dynamite. That was the last time the falls were blasted in 1913, and it didn't stop the shipwrecks. And with the use of the railroad and reinforced steel and concrete replacing granite, traffic died down a considerable amount. Here is something exciting. This was the first four-masted vessel above the falls. It was powered by both steam and sail, pictured at Stimson's Wharf. I don't know the name of this vessel, but it was exciting enough that they took pictures and sent out postcards. And it wasn't all strictly business. In 1875, a poor lumberman named Charles Campbell came from Calais. He was hoping to come into enough money to marry the Goldsboro girl he pined for. He made a wager with some big money guys that he couldn't ride a log through the Sullivan Falls, survive, and come out still upright on the log for $1,000. So he planned to do this on the 4th of July, and you can see these clippings from February where he had found himself a 38-foot log and had it set out by the side of the road near the residence of George Whitaker. And this gained a lot of attention. Charles, he was an expert at log driving on the river, but they were worried how he would do in Sullivan Falls. Closer to the date, here on July 1st, on the left, you could see a letter from someone who is poo-pooing his efforts. They say that a young man proposes to ride over Sullivan Falls on a log at the height of the running out on the 5th of July next, which was it the 4th of July or 5th, either one. This dangerous feat is to be performed not in the interest of science, humanity, or rational amusement even, but as an exhibition of reckless and foolhardy daring. If it be a crime for a man to take his own life willfully, it must follow that it is proportionately a crime to needlessly and recklessly brave dangers which may result in death. Such an exhibition, if allowed to take place, can benefit no one. It will not redound to the interest, credit, or good sense of the exhibitor, and it may cost him his life. As far as the spectators are concerned, it is fair to presume that the moral effect on them would be equal to that which would follow from witnessing a first-class hanging. This young man may perform his feat in safety, but it must not be forgotten that the danger of the act is all that can give zest to the occasion. At the risk of being called an old Betty, I emphatically express the hope that this exhibition will not be allowed to take place. And in the same paper, on the same page, in the Goldsboro section, it says Charles A. Campbell is making preparations for his ride on a single log. Sullivan Falls, the next 5th of July, he will try it. And so he did. It's an interesting story. It was recounted by Samuel Scoville, who purchased Falls Point in the 19 teens, and he interviewed some folks who witnessed that. And I'll read a bit from what he recorded as far as oral history. Folks come from miles around that day to see him, and Falls Point and Hancock Point were black with him. There weren't no moving pictures then, and people turned out for most anything. I were only a youngster, but I knew the falls, and I got there early, up and climbed high up on the bank under a big pine tree just above the cellar, for I figured that would be the place where there'd be the most doing. By the time the crowd were all come to, the ebb had set in, and the falls began to roar like a battle, and the water were full of rifts and rapids and whirlpools. Then the cellar fell open like a trap all set to catch someone. Near me were a gal who were a-shakin' and a-cryin', and someone said she were Charlie's gal. All of a sudden there came a cheerin' from the far side of the point and across the channel from Hancock. It run like a wave along the shore, and Charlie came into sight round the rocks at the end of the point. My, but he looked noble. His long red hair streamed in the wind, and he wore a red flannel shirt, and had a cork belt strapped around him, and he was treading a great saw low with his spiked boots, and waving his hand to the crowd, all gay and gallus. The log came a-bucking and a-pitching through the rapids, but Red, he kept his balance, and how we did cheer. Then a side current caught the log and shot it through the foam toward the cellar, which were boiling like a pot. When he saw what were coming, Charlie's face went white as ashes, but law, weren't there nothing he would do to keep his balance. Right through the rapids, he come not 30 feet from where his gal were sitting. Then the front end of the log went down into the cellar, and it upended and went out of sight, carrying Charlie with it. I mind me how a moan went up from the crowd on both sides of the river, like the wind in the trees. Charlie's gal gave a screech and pitched over in a faint. Then there weren't a sound for a minute or so, as if we were all holding our breath. All of a sudden, a redhead pops up out of the smother of the rapids clear beyond the cellar and was whirled away into the harbor. It was the life belt that had saved him. The log went clear down and come up with a long time later, all splintered and bristled by what it found at the bottom of the cellar, but the cork had kept Red up until some eddy whirled him into the rapids beyond. Some of the men rowed into the harbor and fished him out and hoisted him up to his gal. She fainted when she thought he was drowned, but when she come to see him standing in front of her all dripping and grinning sheepish-like, she up and gave him a slap in the face. "Silly fool," she says, "showing off and scaring people to death. I don't never want to see you again." But she did. She sure did. He saved up enough money to marry her 3 years later in 1878. Her name was Ella Soule, and their only child, Linwood Campbell, was born the following year. So that was an interesting little bit, a part of the Falls history. Here you can see that's the Phillips Eaton. It's pulling a boat through the falls. And the Phillips Eaton, it went through a tough time. It was in 1895, the Julia S. Bailey. It was pulling through the falls, and it couldn't stop the ship from getting wrecked on one of the ledges. And the captain sued the tugboat company, and this lawsuit went on for a few years. It turned into a libel suit, back and forth, and it just about ruined the towboat company business, but they came out of it around 1900. It was settled a few years later. And here is something, I don't know if it'll play, but maybe I can get it to, I did this with a little bit of AI so you could kind of see what it might have looked like with the tugboat pulling the vessel through there. And so, of course, the rest of the 20th century, at the end of the 20th century, it was the Frenchman's Bay Conservancy that raised up enough money to purchase that land and turn that into the preserve that it is now. That's so that it's protected for all future generations to come. And that is the end for now. And we'll take questions, and I will also just like to plug next month's History Hour, which is the troubling story of Dora Jones and the couple from Sorrento. That's being presented by Sam Younger. That will be on February 11th at 7 p.m. via Zoom. I'll go ahead and stop sharing and turn on my camera so that we can take questions if folks have any. Anyone have any questions or comments or memories about the falls? All right. Well, again, oh, I see something in the chat. What's that? Were there sawmills there? There were not sawmills directly on the falls. There was one nearby, which that recorded one of the early fatalities near the falls, which was a Johnson, John Johnson, who was working near there at his mill. The falls themselves were too rough and rapid to utilize that tidal force, though that would have been impressive to think we could harness that power today into something. And all right, so thank you, DJ, for that question. And Raina asks, what is my favorite story that I've come across involving Tidal Falls or Taunton Bay? That's so hard to choose. I've got, I'm so fascinated by all of it. I getting into the old geology as much as things that have happened up to the recent 20th century. I really do like the story of Charles Campbell writing the log, but of course there are some tragic stories which I haven't touched on nearly everything in this, but yeah, I think that Charles Campbell, and he's trying to win that $1,000 wager so that he could afford to marry his gal, have a soft spot for that. He came from Calais, being a poor guy. Folks are from New Brunswick, and the fact that they did get to marry and they have descendants living now, that's I think that's wonderful. That came about because of the falls, so it's a happy little story. And all right, so if we have no more questions, I'd like to thank you all for attending this evening, and I hope to see you all next month at our next History Hour, February 11th. And again, this will be recorded. This will be up on our YouTube channel if you want to share or watch again. And if you have any questions, feel free to email. I've got so much more information and always happy to share. All right. So thank you all. Have a wonderful night. Take care.